You were there to testify on the teacher protection bill. Obviously, there's a problem. Could you describe the problem that needed a solution?
Well, quite simply, it's violence against teachers and other students in classrooms, especially in large urban school districts like Milwaukee. This legislation was pretty much prompted by a report I did called Blood on the Blackboard, Violence Against Teachers in Milwaukee Public Schools. That was nearly 2 years ago, where dozens of teachers said that they were not only attacked, but completely ignored when they tried to bring these concerns before their school administrators. And at the same time, you've had a push towards less discipline in schools, which has fostered this environment of chaos. And so you had teachers coming to me as almost a last resort to tell their stories in the hopes that somebody would finally take them seriously.
And why would the administrators not do anything? What were the reasons for that?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know definitively because they never responded to my reporting. They made vague references to it, I guess, but if I were to venture a guess, it would be because at about the same time that MPS was cutting by a third the number of students it was suspending, year over year it was suspending fewer students, the federal government under President Obama sent a Dear Colleague letter to schools and school districts from the Department of Justice and the Department of Education, basically saying that even if your policy, say, if a student punches another student, they will be suspended, even if that is totally neutral, it isn't in any way discriminatory. If it has what's known as a disparate impact on, say, African American students, it will be considered to be a problem and almost discriminatory in nature. So what school districts, I believe MPS did, to get into line with that was simply not suspend students anymore. And teachers were telling me that they would have a student, they would get referred to the office, this student, for, say, slamming a door. I had one slamming a door in a teacher's broken foot. This guy was hobbling around in a cast, and a teacher, wham! Student slammed the door in his face, and nothing happened. There was no suspension. I mean, what reasonable person would think that behavior is not worthy of a suspension, if not an outright expulsion? But it didn't happen. And my theory, my working theory, and I believe it's supported by the evidence, is that they didn't want to deal with a lawsuit from the federal government. They didn't want to deal with decreased funding from the federal government, and they didn't want to deal with the stigma of being called a racist school district. I mean, would you? Nobody would want that. So it was this unintended consequence of a federal policy that was just disastrous because it fomented this culture of lawlessness in schools where teachers and administrators were scared to discipline students because, oh, if your percentages were a little too high, if this had a disparate impact, the federal government would crack down on you. You're some principal of some small or mid-level school. You really are you're gonna risk getting the federal government upset with you? And the federal government actually did start an investigation in Milwaukee. I mean, my goodness, you talk about pressure to conform. So what happened was, even if teachers wanted to suspend, even if they said, okay, we need to suspend, districts and individual school administrators just weren't because they didn't want to deal with it.
So what is the state willing to do about it now?
Well, what Representative Jeremy Thiesfeld, I should say, is doing is taking a proactive approach and basically empowering teachers at the classroom level to be able to go above the head of a school administrator that they feel is not adequately protecting them. That if they're attacked, they can then go to the president of their school board and say, look, I need you to review this incident. I need you to basically say, this is something that we need a second pair of eyes on. More importantly, what it does is it allows teachers to not feel trapped by their own administrators in that they have another place to go. Moreover, it allows them, if they're attacked and they want to break their contract, they're allowed to without paying a $2,000 penalty or whatever it is. That's what it is in Milwaukee. And one teacher I spoke with actually did have that. She got her foot slammed in a door by, I think, a second grader, a first or a second grader. And she said, I can't deal with this anymore. She left. She left the teaching profession. A few months later, she gets a bill for $2,000 for breaking her contract. You talk about insult to literal injury. That would be it. So what this does is allows teachers to not have to pay that penalty anymore, too. It also forces DPI to publicize the teacher bill of rights so that they know what their rights are. And it basically is just a package of bills, basically under one bill, I guess, a package of tenets of this bill that give teachers more power when they're dealing with out-of-control students.
Sounds all very common sense, but you're facing, and Representative's facing a lot of opposition to this. Who could be against this and why?
Well, the strongest opposition is coming from disability rights advocates, and they're claiming that this would basically discriminate against, once again, they're operating on a theory of disparate impact, that even though there's nothing that says anything about disabled students, that because disabled students, and it's interesting because when they say disabled, they also include in that EBD, emotionally or behaviorally disturbed. Now, that's not a student. Everybody would say a student who's disabled, you're obviously mentally ill when you're EBD, but there's a difference between a student who doesn't know the difference between right or wrong. Say a student who's severely autistic and can't help but lash out sometimes violently if there's something that goes wrong. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. But an EBD student is a student who is just, well, disturbed emotionally or behaviorally. They're lumped into that same category, yet if they still understand the difference between right and wrong, well, there should still be consequences. There still should be discipline. So the disability rights groups are saying that, well, this legislation is going to have a disparate impact on these disabled students. Well, the counter to that is these students still have what's known as an IEP, an individualized education plan, which means there is an entire committee of teachers and psychologists and speech language professionals that'll come in and have to talk with the board that wants to suspend them. This doesn't change that. They're also offered the protections of the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act, the IDEAS Act, Individuals with Disability in Education, and a section of the Rehabilitation Act also deals with this. So they're still offered federal protections. And one of the disability rights groups actually said, no, this bill, the Teacher Protection Act, doesn't come into conflict with the federal ADA. He was forced to admit that. So it's almost as though I don't want to say they're ignoring the federal law that already protects disabled students, but they're conveniently forgetting about it as they're saying that this is going to be so detrimental to disabled students. And certainly, don't get me wrong, as this bill goes through the process, that certainly deserves further study, like how exactly do we differentiate between, say, an EBD student and a student with autism, right? But for purposes of this law, but as I understand the law, what it does is primarily give the teacher who knows the student best more power to determine what should happen to that student. That's my understanding of it anyway.
So this bill is getting a lot of attention. We're kind of nearing the end of the legislative season. So what's going to happen with this bill?
Your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah.
I would love to see it passed. I certainly think it'll get out of committee since it seems as though the committee was very responsive to it. It was in judiciary as opposed to education. I believe it gets out of committee. I'm not sure if it'll be scheduled for a floor vote. I'm hopeful. I would have to talk to Representative Thiesfeld, what he's hearing about this. But we'll see, if not this session, then maybe in 2019.
Sounds good.
All right.
Good for our podcast.
Good. Sorry.